talked a bit about synesthesia. We mentioned that at least earlier. But what is it, and why do people have it?
So I think the first part is easier. What is synesthesia? Right? It's when I mentioned the example before of graphene synesthesia, where say you see a shape like the letter A, and that evokes the experience of a particular color. It could also be across senses, right? It could evoke the sensation of a smell, like A's smell like roses and B's smell like chilies or whatever. Just thought of that. So, and of course, it doesn't have to be about shapes. It doesn't have to be about even it doesn't have to be in the same sense. It could be any sort of atypical association between two sensory experiences, or even between thoughts and experiences. So a really interesting example of that is, I mean, we assume this is a synesthetic person, but there has not been any form of studies. But a colleague of mine has a friend who's a winemaker, and this person describes wine, the taste of wine, always by referring to some shapes. We're saying like, oh, this wine, this is like a corkscrew, and this one is a big blunt one, and it's not necessarily the case, but that sounds very much like somebody having some sort of synesthetic experience of shape when they taste something, right? And so, this sort of thing is, I think it's quite common, right? So there's actually quite a lot of synesthesia in the normal population. It's not always the kind where you see letters in certain colors, and that's sort of most commonly known one, the most popular case. But these sort of somewhat random seeming associations between different sensations, it's probably something that a lot of people experience. Maybe not that strongly, but certainly in varying degrees, a lot of people seem to have that. And so when it manifests in this very obvious and straight way, like letters and colors or letters and smells, that's obviously when something it's probably more easily noticed, right? Because if people talk about, oh, I see these letters in colors, then and other people don't, it's like, but they're all black. Then it's something that you easily talk about. That's people will actually notice that this person has this unusual experience, and that's probably why we know about those cases more. But so what's probably happening here? So that's the part where it gets more difficult. Like these sort of associations, that is what synesthesia is. It's sort of somewhat random seeming association between different senses and states. But why it's happening is probably, and that we're still guessing. That this is part of active research that people are doing. But it's that there may be connections between different parts of the brain, different neural populations that encode these different states and different sensations. And that these connections exist in this particular person, so that if you see the letter A, the neurons that codes for the letter A is responding, but it's connected to the neurons that code for the color red, right? And so therefore, this connection co-activates both the letter and the red, and that's why you have this synesthetic experience. And that this connection doesn't exist in everyone, right? So that, and the reason that could be is that we know that in brain development, when you're a newborn, the brain is much more connected than later on, right? So there are a lot of neural connections that get pruned by development, and partly because of your experiences you're having. And so it could be that this pattern of what gets pruned and which connections remain, that differs between different people, because we all have different experiences, and we have some of these things could be completely random, right? So that it's basically this sort of network, how it looks in one person isn't the same as in another person. So that's basically what we now think is what synesthesia is. And I think it's interesting to come to discuss this, because coming back to the thing we talked about imagery before. So the current thinking on what imagery is and why people differ in their imagery is probably very similar, right? This is also about different connections in the brain. In this case, it will not be different sensations that are co-activating, but when you picture something in your mind, that must involve this network as well, because the process of even voluntarily or even involuntarily creating a sort of picture or it's an inner sensation, that must be involving different parts of the brain than the early sensory areas. So there's probably some crosstalk between them when you imagine something. So that's certainly how we think about imagery at the moment. And so the strength of these connections and which connections there are, even in the first place, that probably differs between people. And so in an aphantasic person, there may be different kinds of, or less, or different or less, who knows? But certainly this network is probably looks different than in a person who's hyperphantasic, that they have a different sort of connectivity. And so in a sense, the sort of range of imagery we have and the range of synesthesia that people might have, they're actually possibly caused by a very similar underlying process. It's just that how it manifests is very different because it's about different connections between different things, right? But that in the end, the brain is a very complicated network, and basically that complex network, how that looks in a particular person, that must be partly what determines who this person is, right? How they're thinking, and who the person behind.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. One, that you bring up the link between the previous discussions on what kind of mental imagery we have, and as well how you know with synesthesia, it's a kind of a spectrum. So in a way, it's against hypothesis, but if it's to do with like the different degree to which different brain areas are connected up with each other, and like for example, you probably know of the Buber Kiki sort of thing where it's I'll put it up, but it's something in cognitive science where people have these names, Buber and Kiki, and they associate the Kiki with the spiky object and the Buber with the more round one, and it's like why, but also in a weird way it makes intuitive sense, at least to me. Like, yeah, I guess you can see why, but it's also illogical, and there's no rational reason you can give for the association, and so that kind of makes me think that synesthesia has some kind of role in cognition that maybe it's also maybe it's like a silly byproduct. I don't know, but yeah, it seems actually that it is something that we do. It's not necessarily just like a kind of rare thing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So the way I would think about this is that obviously our brains are networks, right? We are making connections all the time, and that's a very good example. The fact that you associate these sort of sharp angles with a sort of sharp clicking noise in the vocalization, that somehow gets built into your network, right? That's probably where that comes from. We have these associations. You wouldn't call this synesthesia because it's something that everybody has, right? So the reason things get called synesthesia is because they seem to be unusual. That's atypical that somebody would see letters in certain colors, and or that they associate a wine with a corkscrew. It's just something that doesn't come up. But I think it is just that we are all unique, right? And so this has always been a driving force in my life, but also in my research, that I want to understand what makes people unique and what it is that makes you, right? And I think we all have probably different associations and connections. We wouldn't call them synesthesia because they are that we don't notice this because we rarely discuss those particular experiences with others, and they're not as obvious as seeing a letter in a color, right? But we probably all have this sort of unique picture of associations we're making. It is just that in people that are obviously synesthetic, that they, it just is much more clear that it's quite obvious when people talk about colored letters. But yeah, I think that the underlying process is certainly not abnormal in the sense, right? It's just how their brains are wired up, presumably, right? So that you certainly wouldn't call it a disorder or a condition because it's not something out of the ordinary as such. It's just it manifests in a sort of extraordinary way in this particular person. That's what I probably would think about.